In our lesson today, we're going to be continuing our series on the book of James. And as we've studied this book, as we continue to study this book, what we see is James is describing for us that our faith in Christ is something that is to be put in practice. It's something that we live out throughout our daily lives. And this passage that we're going to be looking at in this lesson today, the second half of James chapter 2, probably presents this idea in the most clear terms than anywhere else in the book, where James clearly makes the case in this passage that faith has to be put into practice. Faith has to be seen and not just be some belief that we have. What he's going to talk about in this passage and what we're going to be talking about in our lesson today is faith and works. How these go together, how they are necessarily dependent upon one another and cannot be separated from each other. So that we're going to see what James has to say here in James chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. He's going to begin by talking about those who claim to have faith. But he's going to explain that just claiming to have faith is not enough. James 2, verses 14 through 17. He said, "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." So here James asks the question, can faith without works save us? Now this is an important question. It was important for them as James was writing to them. It's important for us today to understand the answer to this question. Not just what we think or what we wish the answer is, but what does the Bible say about this? What is James going to say as he explains this concept and shows the answer to this question? Can faith without works save? There are many people in the religious world who believe that it can, that we can be saved without obeying the Lord, just as long as we have faith, as long as we believe in Him, that faith alone is enough to save us. Now, to be fair, many who believe this and who will say that we're saved by faith alone apart from any works that we might do, most of them will probably say that we should do good works because we're to want to do God's will and be pleasing to Him, that this is a sign of our sanctification or however they describe this. But they don't believe that these works are necessary for salvation. And so they've made a separation there between the faith and the works. They'll say the works should be there, but we can be saved whether they're there or not because we're saved by faith alone. But faith is going to lead us to act. This is the point that James is making throughout all of this. He returned to a point that he's made a couple times now already in the book about helping others. He talked about a brother or sister who is without food. He's coming to you and they're needing help. And rather than helping, you just say, "Go in peace, be warmed and be filled." You wish them well, you send them on their way, but you don't actually help them. He said at the end of chapter 1 that we are to practice pure and undefiled religion, which included visiting orphans and widows in their distress, which means helping those who are in need. And then he talked about how we are to treat someone who is poor who comes into the assembly in the first part of James chapter 2. And then here he's talking about you have a brother or sister who is in need and how we are to help them. When we think about how our faith is to be put into practice, one of the ways that that is manifested is how we treat others, and especially those who are in need, whether it's orphans and widows, whether it's a poor person who comes into the assembly, or a brother or sister who is in need, as he describes here in this passage. As Christians, we are to take advantage of opportunities to help others. Paul would say over in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 that we are to, as we have opportunity, do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. That's for each one of us as Christians. As we each individually have these opportunities, we need to take advantage of them. And so James says that if we're living by faith, that's what we're going to do. We find someone in need, someone comes to us and they're in need, we are going to help them. But he made the point there in that passage that faith without works is dead. Notice again what he said in James chapter 2 and verse 17. Even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Faith without works is dead. When we read about faith in the New Testament, we read about an active faith. It's not just a mere belief that has nothing attached to it, no works involved or nothing like that. It is a faith that is an active faith. That's what is described in the New Testament. That's the type that is a saving faith. Again, go back to verse 14, where he said there that what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith? Again, the claim is made. He says he has faith, but he has no works. Can that faith save him? So James asked the question, can that faith that has no works save him? Well, he said in verse 17 that faith without works is dead. A dead faith is not the type of faith that will save. And so when he says faith without works is dead, he's not saying that, well, here we have, we're on our way to salvation, but we have a dead faith. No, faith without works, this dead faith will not lead to salvation. It will not result in that. A dead faith will not save. Then James goes on and talks about the fact that faith with no works is useless. Over in James 2, as he continues, verses 18 through 20, he says, but someone may well say, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Many claim to have faith, even though they're not following God, even though they're not serving Him or obeying Him, that they're not active in His service. They'll still claim to have faith. Yes, I believe that Jesus is the Christ. Yes, I believe that God created us. Yes, I believe that Jesus died on the cross for my sins. There are a lot of people who believe those things, but they're not actively following Him. They don't have those works. But James explained that works demonstrate faith. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Without doing these works, there is no evidence of faith. We might claim to have faith, but it's just an empty claim. There's nothing behind it. There's nothing to back it up. And he went on to say, in emphasizing this point, he says that even the demons believe. He says, you believe that God is one, and a lot of people will say that, even though they're not real committed in assembling and worshiping and serving God and doing those things. They'll say that, well, I believe that God is one. They'll still say that. Well, James says the demons also believe. We have examples in the life of Jesus where you have demons confessing that He was the Son of God, that He was from heaven. Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 and 29 says, when He came to the other side into the country of the Gadarenes, 2 men who were demon-possessed met Him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. And they cried out, saying, what business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come to torment us before the time? So here you have these demons who had possessed these individuals here, and they addressed Jesus as the Son of God. They knew who He was. They also knew He had authority over them. And they addressed Him as the Son of God. Over in Mark chapter 1, verses 23 and 24, It says, then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So here we have demons, unclean spirits. They are testifying about who Jesus is. They recognize who he is. They have a belief about him that is like a lot of religious people today, that they believe he's the Son of God. They believe he's the Holy One, that he is from heaven. But are they going to be saved? Are these demons going to be saved? Are we looking forward to a reward in heaven? And when we get to heaven, we're going to find the demons over there that because they believe that God is one, that they're also going to, because they have that belief, they have that faith, and so they're going to be there in heaven. No, they're not going to be saved. They might believe in who Jesus is, but they don't accept him. They don't follow him. They don't obey him. They're not going to be saved. And James explained here in these verses that faith without works is useless. He said there, are you willing to recognize this? And he used a almost what we think of as an insult. Are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? His point is that it is foolish to think that faith that has no works is going to accomplish anything, that it's good for anything. Faith without works is something that has no value. Just as the demons might acknowledge Christ as the Son of God, it's useless. It doesn't do any good because they do not obey him. So James says faith without works is useless. And then he talks about this idea of justification. And justification by faith and works. That both of these are going to go together. James 2:21 through 25. He says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works, and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way?" So here, James cited two examples of people who were justified by works. He mentioned Abraham, who he used the example of how he was willing to offer up his son, that God called him to take his son, the son of promise, Isaac, and offer him up as a sacrifice. And Abraham was willing to do this. And he was stopped at the last moment because he had proven that he was willing to obey God no matter what that meant, no matter what it cost him. Now, the Hebrew writer explained in Hebrews chapter 11 the thought process that Abraham had, that he considered that God is able to raise the dead, and thinking that, well, the only way that this is going to work is that I offer the son of promise, I offer my son, but surely God's going to raise him from the dead. Now, God had the power to do that. Abraham was right about that. But that wasn't God's plan. God's plan was to stop him from doing this. But Abraham proved by that work, by what he did, that he was a man of faith, that he believed God. He demonstrated that by his works. He also mentions Rahab in verse 25. She is the one from Jericho who helped the messengers who came to spy out the city, as is described in Joshua chapter 2. She had heard about what the Israelites, what God on their behalf was doing to all of the different nations that they encountered on their way to the land of Canaan, on their way to Jericho. And she knew the city was going to be theirs. The city was going to be taken. And so she wanted to be on their side. She wanted to be on God's side. She believed, but what did she do? She helped the messengers, and she hid them so that they would be safe and they would be able to return after their mission of spying out the city. James explained here, by using these examples, he explained that faith works with one's works. He said in verse 22, faith was working with his works. Without works, as we've talked about, faith is dead, or faith is useless. But with the works, he says it is perfected. Abraham's actions led God to count him as righteous. It says there in verse 23, the scriptures were fulfilled, which says that Abraham believed God and was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Paul made the same point over in Romans chapter 3, that he believed God. He was counted as righteous based upon his faith, and as James explains, his works as well. Now, when we think about this idea of justification, that we are justified by faith, or justified by works, as James points out, justification simply means that God recognizes us or declares us to be righteous. Abraham was justified by both faith and works. Paul emphasizes faith in Romans chapter 4, but James explains here in this passage, and just noticed on the screen here they have the wrong reference. It should be James 2:21 rather than 1:21. But James explains here in this verse that we read that Abraham was justified by works. Now these don't contradict each other, these passages. Instead, they are explaining one another. Abraham believed God, so he obeyed God. He was justified by his faith, which led to his works. He was justified on that basis. He was justified by faith and works, just as we are today. Romans 5:1 says that we are justified by faith. And James says here in this verse, James 2:24, you see that man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Again, those passages don't contradict. Because Paul didn't say in Romans 5:1 we're justified by faith alone. He said we're justified by faith. And James helps explain what that means. That we're justified by faith that is active, that is working. The Hebrew writer said over in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9 that Jesus is the author of salvation to those who obey him. They believe him, and that leads them to act, that leads them to obey him. Abraham believed God, that led him to act. It led him to engage in these works that God called him to do. We believe, we have faith, and that faith leads us to act. We're justified by works and not by faith alone. And so then, as James brings this to a close, he says there in the last verse of this chapter, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. He concludes this section by returning to this point about a dead faith. If we have no works, our faith is dead. And as we saw there in verse 17 and verse 14, if we have a dead faith, verse 17, that faith is not going to save us, verse 14. Faith without works, can that save us? No, because faith without works is dead. He used the illustration of a body and the spirit. Once the spirit departs, the body's dead. Once our soul departs from our body is dead. There's no more life in it. The spirit is what animates the body and makes it alive. Our works animate our faith and make it alive. That's his point. That's what he's explaining here. The body without the spirit is dead. Faith without works is dead. We have to have works animating our faith, or else we have a dead faith. We cannot have just one or the other. If we just have faith, that faith can't save us if it doesn't have works. It's useless. It won't justify us. It doesn't do us any good. Now, we could also say that, well, if we have all these works, we're doing these things, but we really don't believe in God. Well, that's not going to do us any good either. We can't separate these from one another. We're not justified by faith alone. We're not justified by works alone. They have to go together. We cannot have one or the other. They have to be part of the same thing. This is part of our life. Faith without works is dead. We have to have a living, active faith in order to please God. So as we draw this lesson to a close, let's remember that we have to have faith if we're going to please the Lord and be saved by Him. Yet this faith is more than just a belief in Christ. It includes an obedient trust in Him. This is what faith is. We need to make sure that we're serving the Lord according to His Word, demonstrating our faith, doing what He has instructed us to do, just as Abraham did. Just as the examples that James gave, the examples that we see in the Bible with the Christians in the first century, they followed the Lord. They followed the commands that He gave. They were faithful. They showed that through their works. We need to serve the Lord and follow His will. Do what He has instructed us to do. We can claim to have faith. You have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without the works. We can't do it. And James says, I will show you my faith by my works. That's what we need to be doing every day. Not just claiming to have faith, but proving that we have faith through the things that we do. So let's remember, in everything that we do, as we go throughout this life, we are to prove that we have faith. We don't want to have a dead faith. We don't want to have a useless faith. We want to have a faith that is living and active, a faith that will save us. That means we believe in the Lord, and we're willing to do more than just believe in who He is, but we follow Him and obey Him. Let's be doing that throughout our life. Continue to serve Him in everything that we do.